After a long shift, Black Nurse Paris was confronted by an aggressive neighbor who didn't bitch about her refusal to comply. The racial slurs turned into a physical assault, but he didn't expect her to fight back. Now he will have to answer for his actions, and that's just the beginning. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Let me know in the comments, what would you do if you were a woman? Paris's shoulders sagged under the weight of exhaustion as she stepped out of the sliding hospital doors into the cool night air. The faint hum of fluorescent lights and the steady beep of patient monitors echoed in her mind, lingering even as she left the hospital behind. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself and took a deep breath, hoping the crisp breeze would offer some relief after a grueling 12-hour shift. It was just past midnight, her usual shift end time, yet tonight felt heavier than others, as if every moment of the day had pressed into her bones. She worked in the emergency room, a place that demanded patience, quick thinking, and emotional control. Over the course of the night, she had handled everything from a broken arm to a patient in cardiac arrest, each case carrying its own emotional weight. But the hardest part wasn't the patients. It was the constant second-guessing from colleagues and the subtle, cutting remarks from a few of them. Paris had grown used to the looks, the silent assumptions that a black woman couldn't possibly be as competent as her white counterparts. It was an ever-present undercurrent in her life, something she'd learned to navigate but never quite shake off. As she made her way across the parking lot toward her car, she couldn't help but replay some of the night's interactions in her mind. A patient's family member had refused to believe Paris was the lead nurse on duty, asking instead to speak with someone more experienced. And though her colleagues had intervened, the sting of the assumption still lingered. Paris tried to brush it off. She was used to being underestimated, used to smiling through the subtle slights, but the emotional toll of it all was real. By the time she reached her car, the only thing she could think about was getting home, sinking into her bed, and leaving the day behind her. Her old sedan waited for her at the far end of the parking lot, just where she had left it earlier that evening. It wasn't much, a reliable, slightly dented Toyota that she had saved up for over the years, but it was hers, a small token of the independence she had fought so hard to maintain. Unlocking the door with a tired sigh, Paris slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the hospital lot. The streets were mostly empty at this late hour, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Paris's mind drifted as she drove, the hum of the tires on the asphalt a soothing background noise. She thought about the small comforts awaiting her at home, a warm shower, soft pajamas, and the silence of her own apartment. She had no idea that tonight the challenges she faced at work would pale in comparison to what was waiting for her just outside her front door. The parking lot of Paris's apartment building was quiet when she arrived, illuminated by a handful of flickering lights. She pulled in slowly, scanning the lot for a free space. Most of the spots were taken, typical for this time of night. After circling the lot once, she finally spotted an open space near the entrance, and relief washed over her. Parking close to the building meant she wouldn't have to walk far in the cold, and she was grateful for the small favor. Paris carefully aligned her car between the painted lines, her movements slow and deliberate from fatigue. Just as she cut the engine and reached for her bag, she heard the screech of tires. A white SUV whipped into the lot, pulling to a sudden, aggressive stop just inches from her front bumper. The abruptness of the movement startled her, and for a moment, she sat frozen in her seat, her heart thudding in her chest. The driver's door of the SUV flew open, and out stepped a middle-aged white man, her neighbor Henry. Paris recognized him immediately. He lived a few doors down from her, and though they had never exchanged more than a passing nod, she was all too familiar with the type of man he was. Henry had a reputation in the building, the kind of neighbor who always found something to complain about, the kind who treated every small inconvenience as a personal slight. And now, it seemed, he had decided that Paris's presence in the parking lot was just such an offense. "That's my spot," Henry barked, slamming the door of his SUV behind him. His voice was loud, sharp, and full of frustration, cutting through the stillness of the night. Paris blinked, still seated in her car. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," he snapped, stalking toward her. "That's my spot. You need to move." Paris fought the urge to roll her eyes. She had just spent 12 hours managing people who were actually in crisis. Dealing with an entitled neighbor was the last thing she needed right now. She took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay calm. "This spot wasn't marked," she said evenly, opening her car door to step out. "There's no sign or anything saying it's reserved." Henry sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. "Doesn't matter. Everyone knows that spot is mine. I always park here." Paris met his gaze, her own exhaustion making her less patient than usual. "I didn't see anyone waiting, so I parked. It's late, and I just got off a long shift. I'm not moving my car." The moment the words left her mouth, she could see the shift in Henry's expression. His face darkened, his eyes narrowing with contempt. It wasn't just about a parking space anymore. His posture, his tone, everything about him radiated hostility. "You people," he hissed, the words dripping with disdain, "always think you can do whatever you want. No respect for anyone else." Paris felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had heard those words before, too many times. They weren't about parking spaces or misunderstandings. They were about power, control, and the belief that she didn't belong. "Look," she said, keeping her voice steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. "I'm not looking for trouble. I just want to park my car and go inside." But Henry wasn't listening. He took a step closer, looming over her, his breath hot and sour in the cold night air. "You think you can just ignore people? Think you're above everyone else? You're all the same." Paris clenched her fists at her sides, forcing herself to stay calm. She had seen where situations like this could lead, and she wasn't about to let her anger get the best of her. Not tonight. "Sir, please," she said quietly. "I don't want any trouble." Henry laughed, a low, bitter sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Too late for that, sweetheart." He stepped even closer, blocking her path back to the building. Paris's pulse quickened, fear mixing with anger as she realized just how quickly the situation was spiraling out of control. This night was supposed to be over. She was supposed to be inside by now, sipping tea and letting the stress of the day melt away. Instead, she stood face to face with a man whose eyes were filled with a kind of hatred that went far beyond a parking dispute. Paris knew this wasn't about the spot. It was about who she was and who he thought she wasn't allowed to be. She just wanted to get home, but it was clear now, Henry wasn't going to let that happen without a fight. Paris stood rooted to the asphalt, her heart hammering in her chest as Henry closed the distance between them. The night air felt heavier now, thick with tension. She clenched her fists tighter, trying to keep herself calm. Every instinct screamed at her to avoid confrontation, but the venom in Henry's words and his looming presence left her feeling cornered. Henry's sneer deepened as he took another step toward her, invading her personal space. "You people think you can just take what you want," he spat. His voice dripped with malice, each word sharpened by years of prejudice. "Disrespectful, entitled, just like the rest of them." The phrase hit Paris like a slap. You people. It was more than a slur. It was a reminder that no matter what she achieved or how hard she worked, to men like Henry, she would always be an outsider, a trespasser in their world. Her pulse raced, and for a moment, all she could hear was the blood pounding in her ears. "Sir, I'm asking you to back up," Paris said, forcing her voice to stay level, though her muscles were tense. "I don't want any trouble." But Henry didn't stop. Instead, he smiled, a cold, cruel grin that made Paris's skin crawl. "What are you going to do about it, huh?" he taunted, jabbing a finger toward her chest. "You going to run? Go ahead. That's what you people do, isn't it?" The insult ignited a spark inside Paris, years of bottled-up frustration bubbling to the surface. She had dealt with too many men like Henry, people who thought they could belittle and intimidate her without consequence. But no more. Not tonight. "Get out of my way," Paris said, her voice firmer this time. She stepped forward, attempting to move past him. That's when Henry shoved her. The force of the push sent Paris stumbling backward, her body slamming into the side of her car. The sharp pain of metal digging into her shoulder jolted her, but the emotional sting was far worse. For a moment, she stood there in disbelief, stunned that he had dared to put his hands on her. Henry's smug grin widened. "What's the matter? You can't handle a little push?" he sneered, taking another step closer. "Maybe now you'll learn some respect." Something inside Paris snapped. Without thinking, she shoved him back, hard. Her hands connected with his chest, sending him staggering a few steps. Henry's expression twisted into a mask of rage, and before Paris could react, he lunged at her. The scuffle was quick and chaotic. Henry's hands grabbed at her jacket, trying to drag her down, but Paris fought back with everything she had. She twisted, kicking out with her leg, catching him in the shin. He cursed under his breath, but the pain only seemed to fuel his anger. They grappled near the car, their shoes scraping against the pavement, breaths coming in ragged gasps. Paris managed to free herself from his grip, but Henry was relentless. He lunged again, grabbing her arm and yanking her toward him. Paris felt herself losing balance, but this time she refused to fall. With a surge of adrenaline, she swung her elbow up, catching Henry squarely in the jaw. He staggered, clutching his face with a grunt of pain. "You bitch," he snarled, wiping at his lip, which now had a small trickle of blood. Paris's chest heaved with each breath. She didn't want this fight. She never wanted it to go this far. But here they were, two people locked in a battle neither of them had intended, yet both unwilling to back down. By now, the commotion had attracted attention. A few neighbors had gathered on the edges of the parking lot, watching the confrontation unfold. Some whispered among themselves, while others pulled out their phones, recording every second of the fight. Paris caught sight of the spectators, and a wave of humiliation washed over her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was being put on display. Every shove, every insult, every breathless struggle was now someone's entertainment, captured on a screen. Henry seemed to relish the attention. He puffed out his chest, playing the role of the righteous victim. "See what I have to deal with?" he called out to the onlookers, his voice loud and self-assured. "This is what happens when you try to stand up to them." Paris's jaw tightened. She knew what he was doing, twisting the narrative to make himself look like the victim. And she knew that if the police arrived and believed his version of events, everything could spiral out of control. The blare of sirens cut through the night, and Paris's stomach dropped. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the surrounding cars as two police cruisers pulled into the lot. Henry grinned, his face lighting up with smug satisfaction. "You're in for it now," he whispered, just loud enough for Paris to hear. The officers stepped out of their vehicles, their faces stern and unreadable. Henry wasted no time, rushing toward them with exaggerated distress. "Thank God you're here," he exclaimed, clutching his side as if he were in pain. "This woman attacked me out of nowhere." Paris stood frozen for a moment, her breath shallow in her chest. She knew how these situations could play out. She had seen the headlines. Black people being accused, misjudged, punished, even when they were the ones defending themselves. One of the officers approached her, his hand resting casually on the holster of his gun. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle," he ordered, his tone cold and authoritative. Paris raised her hand slowly, trying to keep her movements calm and deliberate. "I didn't attack him," she said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "He shoved me first. I was just defending myself." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced over at Henry, who was now playing up his injuries, groaning and holding his side like he'd been gravely wounded. "Look at me," Henry cried, gesturing to the small cut on his lip. "She went crazy. I didn't do anything to her, I swear." Paris felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew she was walking a tightrope balancing between truth and perception. Every word she said, every movement she made, could be twisted against her. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us," the officer said, his hand still on his holster. Before Paris could respond, another officer approached, holding up a hand. "Wait," he said, glancing at the small group of onlookers. "Anyone here see what happened?" Several people shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact, but then a voice piped up from the back of the crowd. "I've got it on video," a young woman called out, holding up her phone. "He attacked her first. I've got the whole thing right here." The officers exchanged glances, the tension between them shifting slightly. The first officer, who had been ready to detain Paris, stepped back, his posture relaxing. "Let's take a look at that," the second officer said, motioning for the woman to step forward. Paris exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Relief washed over her in waves, but the fear and humiliation still lingered. She knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Henry's face twisted in fury as the officers reviewed the footage on the phone. His bravado began to crumble as the reality of the situation set in. "You can't believe that," he shouted, his voice rising in desperation. "She provoked me. I was defending myself." But the officers weren't buying it. One of them turned to Paris, his expression softer now. "We'll need a full statement from you, ma'am," he said. "It looks like we've got some evidence to review." Henry opened his mouth to argue, but the officers were already turning their attention away from him. The young woman who had recorded the video gave Paris a small, encouraging smile, and for the first time that night, Paris felt like she wasn't alone. But as she stood there in the cold parking lot, watching the officers escort Henry toward their cruiser, she knew this was just the beginning. There would be statements to give, reports to file, and possibly even a court case. The fight wasn't over yet, but for now at least, Paris had the truth on her side. The next morning, Paris sat in her small kitchen, cradling a steaming mug of coffee. The events of the previous night lingered like a bad dream she couldn't shake. Her body ached from the struggle, and her mind buzzed with everything that had happened. Henry's insults, the shove, the arrival of the police, and the flashing lights that painted the night in chaos. She couldn't stop replaying it all, wondering if there was anything she could have done differently. The fear that gripped her now wasn't just about what had already happened. It was about what might come next. Would the police believe her side of the story? Would Henry's lies twist the truth? She knew the odds weren't always in her favor. For people like her, the system often worked against them. Even with evidence, even with witnesses, the narrative had a way of shifting in favor of people like Henry. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from the officer who had taken her statement. They had reviewed the footage from the bystander's phone, and the police were now gathering more evidence, including security footage from the apartment complex. Relief mixed with anxiety. The camera footage might be the key to proving what had really happened, but it also meant she wasn't done reliving the incident. She would need to give more details, face more questions, and possibly confront Henry again in court. Later that day, Paris sat in the police station, waiting to be called in to give a more detailed statement. The sterile environment, cold floors, humming lights, reminded her of the hospital, though without the same sense of purpose. Here, the waiting was heavier, laced with uncertainty. An officer finally called her into a small interview room. She sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Thank you for coming in, Miss James," the officer said, glancing down at his notes. "We've reviewed some of the footage from the parking lot, and it matches the preliminary accounts. Now, we need a detailed statement from you. Start from the beginning. Don't leave anything out." Paris took a deep breath. She began recounting the events from the moment she arrived home, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. She described how Henry had blocked her path, insulted her, and shoved her without provocation. As she spoke, the officer listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "How did you feel when he first confronted you?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. Paris hesitated for a moment. "At first, I was just tired. I didn't think it would turn into anything serious. But when he started using those words, 'you people,' I knew it wasn't just about a parking spot." The officer nodded, jotting down her words. "And when he shoved you, what was your immediate reaction?" I didn't want to fight him," Paris admitted, her voice soft, "but I felt like I had no choice. He wouldn't let me leave, and I knew if I didn't stand up for myself, it could get worse." The officer's pen hovered over his notepad. "We've seen situations escalate quickly in cases like this. You did what you had to do." Once her statement was complete, the officer walked her through the next steps. They would examine the apartment complex's security footage, and if the evidence aligned with her statement, they would move forward with charges against Henry. "Do you think he'll try to twist the story?" Paris asked, a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. The officer gave her a sympathetic look. "He already has. He's claiming you attacked him first and that he acted in self-defense. But with the footage we have, we're confident the truth will come out." Paris exhaled slowly, grateful for the officer's reassurance, but still uneasy. She knew how easily stories could be manipulated, how quickly blame could be shifted. Over the next few days, Paris struggled to return to her normal routine. Every time she stepped out of her apartment, she felt the weight of curious glances from neighbors who had witnessed the confrontation. Some offered her sympathetic smiles, but others looked at her with thinly veiled judgment. She kept to herself as much as possible, focusing on her work at the hospital. But even there, the memory of the parking lot confrontation haunted her. She couldn't help but wonder what Henry was telling people, what version of the story was spreading through the building. One evening, just as Paris was returning home from another exhausting shift, her phone rang. It was the police. They had reviewed the security footage from the apartment complex, and the evidence was clear. Henry had attacked her first. "We're moving forward with charges," the officer told her. "We'd like you to come in tomorrow to review the footage yourself and prepare for the next steps." Paris felt a wave of relief wash over her. The truth was on her side. But the road ahead was still long, and she knew that facing Henry in court would not be easy. That night, Paris sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She looked tired, more tired than she had felt in a long time. But beneath the exhaustion there was a flicker of resolve. She had spent too many years staying silent, avoiding confrontation, trying to blend in and not draw attention to herself. But this time was different. This time, she couldn't back down. Henry's actions were a reminder that no matter how hard she worked or how much she achieved, there would always be people who saw her as less than. But she refused to be reduced to their expectations. Paris took a deep breath, steadying herself. Tomorrow, she would go to the station, review the footage, and prepare for the fight ahead. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing about this process would be. But she had come too far to give up now. As she lay down and closed her eyes, her thoughts began to settle. The anxiety was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but it was accompanied by something stronger: determination. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up for herself, for her dignity, and for every other person who had ever been told they didn't belong. And she was ready to fight. The courtroom was packed, and the atmosphere was thick with tension as Paris entered. She felt every gaze on her, as though the weight of expectation and judgment clung to her shoulders. Sitting across the room, Henry glanced up briefly, locking eyes with her. His expression was cold. His lips curled into a sneer, as if he still believed he could walk away from this unscathed. Paris sat beside her lawyer, Ava Hayes, a sharp and determined young woman with a fierce reputation. Ava's steady presence gave Paris a sliver of reassurance, but the anxiety still coiled in her stomach. This trial wasn't just about a parking dispute. It was about whether or not the truth would prevail. It was about standing up to someone like Henry, who had spent his life believing he could bully people into submission without consequence. The judge gavelled the courtroom to order, and the proceedings began. Ava stood confidently, delivering a succinct opening statement that laid out the facts. Henry had instigated the confrontation, assaulted Paris, and damaged her property. She emphasized that the issue at hand was more than just a moment of anger. It was about power, prejudice, and accountability. "This case," Ava said, her voice steady and calm, "is not simply a disagreement over a parking space. It is a clear instance of harassment, physical assault, and an attempt to demean someone because of who they are." Henry's lawyer, a polished man in his 50s, took the floor next. He painted Henry as a stressed individual having a bad day, arguing that his actions were impulsive and not motivated by prejudice. The defense sought to shift focus from Henry's slurs and aggression to his supposed stress, hoping the jury might sympathize with his version of events. Paris listened, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. It was hard to hear herself being described as the aggressor, as though her actions in self-defense were somehow equal to Henry's unprovoked attack. But she knew she had to stay calm. The truth was on her side, and soon the evidence would speak for itself. The prosecution called several witnesses to the stand, neighbors who had witnessed parts of the altercation. One after another, they confirmed that Henry had approached Paris aggressively, and that she had only defended herself when he shoved her. Next, the police officer who had initially reviewed the evidence testified. The officer described the security footage from the parking lot, confirming that it showed Henry as the primary aggressor. The court fell silent as the video was played. The footage captured everything. Henry blocking Paris's way, his racist slurs, the shove, and Paris's defensive response. Paris watched the jury as they viewed the footage, their expressions tense and uncomfortable. She could tell that the video had an impact. There was no room for misinterpretation. When it was Paris's turn to testify, she took the stand with as much composure as she could muster. She recounted the events clearly, explaining how Henry's words and actions escalated the situation. "I didn't want to fight him," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I just wanted to park my car and go inside, but he wouldn't let me. When he shoved me, I reacted to protect myself. I didn't want it to escalate, but he left me no choice." Ava guided Paris through her testimony, ensuring that every detail was clear. Paris also spoke about the emotional toll of the encounter, the humiliation, the fear, and the frustration of knowing that, without the video evidence, things might have gone very differently. When cross-examined by Henry's lawyer, the defense tried to twist Paris's words, suggesting that her reaction was excessive and that she had provoked Henry. But Paris held her ground, calmly reiterating the sequence of events. "I tried to walk away," she said. "He didn't let me." When Henry took the stand, his demeanor shifted. Gone was the aggressive bully from the parking lot. In his place was a contrite, remorseful man, carefully playing the victim. He claimed that he had been having a difficult day, that he was frustrated, and that Paris's refusal to move her car made him feel attacked. "She just wouldn't listen," he said, casting a quick glance toward the jury. "I wasn't trying to hurt her. I was just frustrated." His lawyer tried to paint the incident as a misunderstanding, a moment of poor judgment rather than a deliberate act of aggression. But the video evidence loomed large over his testimony, casting doubt on every word he said. In her closing statement, Ava didn't mince words. She reminded the jury that this was not just about frustration or a bad day. It was about accountability. Henry Smith chose to confront Miss James that night. He chose to use hateful, racist language, and when she stood her ground, he chose to escalate the situation to violence. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an assault, motivated by prejudice. The defense lawyer made one last attempt to appeal to the jury's empathy, asking them to consider Henry's stress and how a single mistake shouldn't define him. But the damage had been done. The evidence was too clear, the witnesses too consistent. The jury deliberated for several hours, and each passing minute felt like an eternity to Paris. She sat in the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mind racing with every possible outcome. She had told the truth. She had done everything she could. But would it be enough? Finally, the jury returned, and the courtroom fell into a hushed silence. The foreperson stood and read the verdict. On the charge of assault, we find the defendant, Henry Smith, guilty. Paris exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Relief washed over her, but it was tinged with exhaustion. The weight she had been carrying for days, weeks, began to lift, though she knew it wouldn't disappear entirely. As the courtroom emptied, Paris remained seated for a moment, letting the reality of the verdict sink in. She had won. Henry would face consequences for his actions, but the victory felt bittersweet. The physical pain from the confrontation would fade, but the emotional scars would linger. When she finally stood to leave, Ava placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did it," she said with a small smile. Paris nodded, grateful for her lawyer's support, but she knew that the fight wasn't over. Not really. There would always be people like Henry, people who thought they could bully, intimidate, and demean others. and there would always be battles to fight. In the weeks following the trial, Paris found herself reflecting on what had happened and what it meant for her future. She realized that she couldn't let this be just another painful memory. She needed to do something with it. She began volunteering with local organizations that focused on racial justice and community empowerment. She shared her story in workshops and public speaking events, hoping to inspire others to stand up for themselves and fight against injustice. One day, after a speaking event, a young woman approached her. "Thank you for sharing your story," the woman said, her eyes filled with emotion. "It made me realize I'm not alone." Paris smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. The road ahead would still be difficult, but she knew she had made the right choice. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had become a voice for others. As Paris drove home that evening, the city lights shimmering in the distance, she glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman staring back at her wasn't the same person she had been on that fateful night in the parking lot. She was stronger now, more determined, and ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, because this time she knew she wouldn't face them alone. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest videos. Stay with us for more powerful stories about justice, courage, and overcoming prejudice. Don't forget to check out our other videos. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Together, let's keep the conversation going and build a more compassionate world.